Welcome, everyone. My name is Aurelio Muraca. I am the technology program coordinator here at the Danbury Library, and this evening I bring to you a special presentation, Herbs in Kitchen Gardens by Master Gardener, Advanced Master Gardener, Donna Katsuranis. Before I give this presentation over to her, I just want to say this program was made possible by the Friends of the Danbury Library. And also, if you're interested in anything herbs and garden and dealing with the soil and going outside and learning about starting your own garden, we're going to be having lots of programs coming up for you in the future. So stay tuned. Please continue to look upon Danbury Library's calendar of events and look forward to future events. We do have one coming up May 10th with another master gardener, Mary Hogue, and we're going to be talking about Danbury and the pollinator pathway, and hopefully Danbury will be on that pathway soon enough. But as we are getting to 5:04 this evening, I'm going to present our very special guest, Advanced Master Gardener, Donna Katsuranis. Donna, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me, Aurelio. I appreciate you reaching out. So good evening. My name is Donna. I am a tree-hugging dirt worshiper, and we probably had a couple of kindred spirits in the crowd tonight. I'm going to talk to you about growing our own food, which a lot of folks have had this concept come up over the course of the last year and have found it very important. My cousin's daughter decided that, in fact, she did enjoy gardening prior to 2020. She just was adamantly opposed to playing in the dirt. But as she put it, when she went to the grocery store and the shelves were bare, she started to panic a little bit. And now she absolutely loves playing in the dirt. So growing our own food is a very broad subject. So what I'm going to be doing is, with a lot of this, kind of skimming over things and giving you the broad brush. If you have questions, put them in the chat. Aurelio will share them with me at the end of the presentation. I can guarantee I won't be able to get to everybody's questions, but if you still have burning questions, feel free to reach out to me. Aurelio sent you an attachment on the response to this evening with the link and everything, so you should have this in your email, and it's got my contact information at the head of the page, so feel free to reach out. I also, as a side gig, in addition to being a minister, I do individual garden consultations. So if you'd like me to come out and visit, I'd be glad to do that. So let's talk about food. This is a red cabbage. It's fairly young. Yes, I did grow this. You can see from the way that the leaves are starting to curve in at the center that it's just thinking about becoming a head. So when we get a little bit further on, I will tell you how to know when a cabbage is ready to harvest. So this is not my garden, but one of the first things that you want to think about with growing your own food is what to grow and where to grow it. Now, these folks have got one thing absolutely down pat, and that is the idea of putting flowers in with their herbs and their vegetables. Two reasons. Thing one, you need to draw pollinators into your garden if you want anything that is fruiting. And when I say fruiting, I don't necessarily mean apples on the apple tree. A tomato is a fruit, as many people know. So is a cucumber, so is a squash, so is a pepper. Any of these things started out as a blossom on the plant, and when that blossom was fertilized, they became fruit. If the blossom doesn't get fertilized, you're not getting any fruit. So you want to make sure you have pollinators in your garden. If you can have some flowers there to draw them in, then your vegetable flowers are much more likely to get fertilized. The other reason to put flowers in your vegetable garden is they're really pretty. There's also a concept called companion planting, which is a subject unto itself. And one of the ideas with companion planting is to plant things that other plants like. So for instance, plant your basil next to your tomatoes. It will enhance the flavor of the tomatoes, and it helps draw in and keep away the right bugs. So the first question in locating our garden is, where's your sunshine? There are some edible plants that will grow in poor sun, not a lot. Most plants that we eat, we want to have full sun for them. Ideally, this is going to be a southern exposure or a western exposure. You can get a lot of sun in the east, but the morning sun is not the hottest sun of the day. And the plants need the light and they need the heat. So the southern exposure and the western exposure, that's the most heat that they're going to get in the summertime. These folks have got some really nice, simple raised beds here. If you are doing raised beds, you want to make sure that you don't make them more than 3 feet across, unless you're really tall and have really long arms. A 3-foot wide bed is about as far as you want to be reaching from either side of the bed to get to your edible matter in the middle there. So the other thing that you want to be looking at, I apologize, is how's your soil? This is a good time of year to be doing a soil test. One of the links that's on the second page of that handout that I sent you is for UConn's soil lab. You can go on that page, you can get the information on how to take a soil sample, how to send it into UConn, and I think it might be up to $12 to do a soil test right now. The paperwork, when you send it in, is going to ask you what you're growing, because they're going to make different recommendations based on whether you're growing apples or potatoes or a lawn. So give them as much information as you can. As I say, the form tells you how to do a soil sample, and they will tell you about the levels of nutrients in your soil, the amount of organic matter in your soil. It's critical to have organic matter in your soil. That's when you're slow feeding your plants. Relying on fertilizer for your plants, that's not the optimal way to feed your garden. It's like expecting your kids to live on Flintstones chewables rather than, if you've got good compost and good organic matter, that's going to be a good balanced diet for the plants, and you're not going to get a whole bunch of runoff. So again, we have this lovely little garden. We're going to be checking our soil to see what we need to do to amend the soil so that it's going to be a good foundation for our plants. We're going to have good sun, and we want to know what we're going to grow. Don't grow stuff that your family's not going to eat. I mean, if you decide that you want to experiment with stuff, that's a cool thing. If it turns out to be stuff that your family's not fond of, make sure you know where your local food pantry is. Because if you have too much, or if you have stuff that the family isn't going to eat, bring that food to the food pantry. There's always people who are in need, and gardeners always have excess. We're all familiar, if we've ever grown zucchini, we're all familiar with how we can be out there picking zucchini every blessed day. And then one day we go out and all of a sudden there is a zucchini the size of a 3-year-old that somehow got missed. And I literally had someone put a baby bonnet on a zucchini once. Where does this beast come from? There's always people who are going to eat these things. Don't leave it on the neighbor's doorstep. So what does your family like to eat? If your family is that rare family that doesn't like tomatoes, maybe you don't want to grow tomatoes. Maybe you want to start simple with just some strawberries or some herbs. So we're going to work our way down through that. Now, the other question, and I think this is the big one, is who's going to maintain your garden? I mean, this inset down here is very colorful and beautiful, and these people obviously knew what they were doing. They've got their pumpkin patch here where it can spread out, because we don't grow pumpkins in little tiny places. They're very spready outy. And they've got their kale here all cheek by jowl, and it's keeping out the weeds. And somebody obviously has a great deal of time on their hands if they're making these little razor sharp edges and maintaining the daylights out of them. I don't know about you, but I have neither the time nor the inclination for something like that. If you do, you should rock on with that. That's the great thing about a garden. It's whatever you want it to be. This young lady is a little bit more my speed. She's got her teddy bear out here helping her. And we've got nice edging around our beds. We've got a little pond that's going to be coming in here. Don't grow a garden that is 50 feet by 50 feet if you're the only one who's going to be maintaining it. I can guarantee you that's a recipe for heartbreak. Start small, start with a small bed, and then build up from there. Learn as you go. And if it doesn't work, that's why God made compost. We have a good compost pile in the corner of the yard, and whatever failed, that can go in the compost. Make sure that you're keeping your maintenance within your scope. So the best thing that you can do for any kind of a garden, whether it's a vegetable garden, a flower garden, whatever, is mulch. Well, the second best thing. The first thing is compost. Second is mulch. Mulch is anything that we put on the surface of the soil to mitigate runoff, to try to keep the weeds down, and to kind of pretty things up a little bit. One of the things that people don't think about with mulch, if you've ever grown tomatoes, you know that halfway through the season, those lower leaves are looking a little skanky. That's because there is a fungal disease that lives in most soil. And when it rains, those fungal spores are splashing up on the underside of the lower leaves. That's why that fungus is creeping up from the lower part of the plant. If we mulch really well around the plant, then the rain won't be splashing up those fungal spores. So there's a lot of reasons to mulch. This picture is, this picture is of the Giving Garden in Brookfield. Now this is on the Erickson Farm open space. A group of us are growing vegetables for the local food pantries and soup kitchens. And this was on planting day a few years ago. And what these volunteers are doing, they're spreading newspaper in between the rows, and that's going to act as a weed barrier. It's a weed mat. We make sure that we have at least 5 layers of paper. We make sure they're overlapping quite a bit so that the weed roots can't sneak in between the layers, which some of them do anyway. And then we put over top of the newspaper, we put this mulch hay. Now, I'm a big fan of just plain old bales of hay from the local farm, except as mulch. When you're using stuff for mulch, you want to make sure that you're getting something that doesn't have weed seeds. And unfortunately, those bales of hay at the local farm, that was all sorts of different things in the field baled up, and they might have gone to seed by the time they were baled. So you could be putting a ton of seeds, weed seeds, in the garden if you use just plain old hay. What we do is we get bagged hay, we get it from Agway, and you can see this fellow here is opening up one of the bags here. The old farmers used to refer to it as salt marsh hay. There's no salt in it, but it is hay that has been processed. Either it's processed before it's gone to seed, or it's been heat treated so that the seeds have been sterilized. They've been killed off. And the hay on top of the newspaper serves to keep the newspaper from flying away in the wind, and it keeps it prettier. So by the end of the season, this newspaper, almost all of it will have decomposed underneath that layer of hay. So we're adding a little bit of carbon to the soil by putting the newspaper in there. The hay also will partly start to decompose by the end of the year. And because we're using organic matter as opposed to stone or plastic weed mat or some monkey business like that, we don't have to worry about ever lifting this stuff up. The challenge when we use gravel for mulch is that it works fine for a period of time, but organic matter and soil and dust sifts down through it. And after a few years, you can't even see the gravel anymore because a soil layer has built up on top of it. And of course, the plants will root and they'll come through. I'm really opposed very much to using any kind of weed mat that is a non-organic material. When you do that, what you're winding up doing is, again, you'll have soil sifting down on top of it. And there are microscopic holes in that weed mat because moisture has to get down through from the rain. And with those holes, the roots from the plants will work their way down through. And after a while, you have a layer of non-organic, I'm never going to decompose weed mat, and you got it completely rifled through with all the plant roots. So it's not a useful thing. If you can use newspaper and hay or newspaper and wood chips, you can see the pile of wood chips in the front here. It's a much better, much more useful thing. We use the wood chips around the perimeter of the garden. We don't put it in the center of the garden because the wood chips require a lot more nitrogen in order to decompose. So they're going to actually be sucking some nitrogen out of the soil. the newspaper and the hay won't be pulling quite so much nitrogen out of the soil. So we just use the wood chips around the perimeter, around the walking path, if you will, around the garden. So mulch, mulch, mulch. You can even mulch your containers, and that's always a useful thing to do. So this is one of those raised beds from the previous picture. They've got some wood chip mulch going on here. We've got cabbages that are beginning to head up. We've got some flowers planted in and amongst. I mean, honestly, these flowers look like impatiens, which are not optimal for drawing in pollinators, but we're not going to split hairs too much. But what we also have is some lettuce leaves in between here. So what these folks did was they planted lettuce and cabbage at the same time. They've been harvesting their lettuce all along, and the cabbage is now getting big enough where it's shouldering out the lettuce. So one of the advantages of planting cheek by jowl that way is it does help to keep weeds down. It can be a little bit iffy if you're in a really humid area, because you can keep fungal disease when the plants are so close together, and air circulation is much more useful for mitigating fungal disease. But what I said before about figuring out when cabbage is ready to harvest. So you can see we've got some little heads forming in the cabbage here. Now, some people are going to look at this and they're going to say, oh, well, I want to wait until this cabbage head is a nice big head. That ain't going to happen. That is not how it works. The cabbage will form the general shape of the head first, and then the new growth is coming up inside that head, and it's firming up the existing, if you will, the hollow shape of the cabbage. So in order to tell if a cabbage is ready to harvest, you have to go up and you have to squeeze it a little bit. If it's real firm, you need to harvest that puppy, even if it's tiny, because it ain't going to get any bigger. And what will happen is, once it has firmed up as far as it's going to go, the plant is going to say, oh, time for me to send flowers up. The whole head is going to split, and a blossom stalk is going to come up from the center, and you've lost your cabbage at that point. So keep an eye on your cabbages and see if this one is starting to look a little bit firm and well-rounded here. These ones look a little bit softer, so they've probably got a little bit more time coming. But once the leaves start to look a little stretched like this, they're getting on toward being close to harvest time. So we've got some red leaf lettuce here. It's interplanted with Dusty Miller just for pretty. These folks are using this garden as much for ornamental as they are for their edibles. We've got some other leaf lettuce back here. This looks like a bolted cilantro that they've got going on here. It looks like a little cabbage, or maybe even a broccoli over here. Something either cucumbery or maybe pumpkin-y over in that garden. So again, they're planting real close. There's no mulch here, but they're planting pretty close, and they've been keeping up with their weeds. So with a raised bed, it's much easier to keep up with the weeds as well. More interplanting of a little bit of everything. I'll be honest, I take exception a little bit here. So we've got some lovely irises that the blooms have gone past on them, and it looks like they've just planted some rhubarb in here. This rhubarb is going to get enormous. It is going to fill this entire space here, and it's planted right up against these irises. They're going to have to either take these irises out, or they're going to lose them completely, because that rhubarb is going to take up the whole spot within 2 or 3 years. So hopefully they're thinking a little further down the road. They've got a little milkweed going on here to feed their monarch butterfly babies. They've got some chives back here. The blossoms have gone past. And these plants over here are probably blackberries. They could be red raspberries. So the blackberries underplanted with the rhubarb, that could work. That could work. I prefer to have a little bit of room to prune around the blackberries, but we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But they've got the general principle going on here of having some flowers, having some edible vegetable matter and berries going on. And you know what? It's all about experimenting. It's all about deciding what's going to work for you, what your family's going to eat, what you're interested in growing. Let the garden be a teaching experience for you as well. So let's talk a little bit about container gardens for the kitchen. One of the best ways to get started with growing our own food is with containers. You know, not everybody is in a place where they can have even a raised bed. Not everybody has a yard, but a lot of people have a front stoop or a back deck or something like that where they can put a few things in some containers. And maybe in years past you had flowers out by the front stoop. Maybe this year you'd like to put some containers that have food in them. So these folks here have repurposed an old kitchen colander to grow some greens in it. I definitely approve of that. I hope they lined the colander with maybe a coffee filter or something to retain the soil so it doesn't all rush right through. A lot of different options for our containers for the garden. This is kind of my dream come true. I would love to be able to whip open my window and just cut some herbs. These folks have got a few strawberries, they've got some thyme. It looks like they got a variegated mint going on here, all sorts of different herbs. These folks have got just a plain old clay pot that they've grown some carrots in. This is slightly unrealistic. You want a much deeper pot than this if you're growing carrots. Carrots are root vegetables, and even if you get the varieties that grow a little bit shorter, they still need a great deal of depth of soil, even if you're growing them in a container. But carrots are a terrific thing to grow on the patio or on the front stoop. You've got all of this wonderful greenery. It's really pretty. And carrots are one of the food sources for the larvae of the swallowtail butterflies. So if you get, we'll see some pictures later on, if you get some pretty striped little caterpillars in there, then you are feeding the larvae for that butterfly. These folks decided to go a little bit larger scale with their container garden. This is actually a livestock watering trough that you would get at Tractor Supply or someplace like that. I will suggest if you get a galvanized metal container, if you use any kind of a metal container for growing plants, it's best to line the inside of the container before you put soil in it. My favorite thing is the rolls of closed cell foam that you can get as packing material. Just put that around the inside of the container because that metal can get wicked hot. And if you've ever found, if you ever picked up a plant at a nursery, any kind of a plant that's been pot bound, you'll notice that the roots are going to the outside of the container. And that's where you've got the white mass of roots and they're just plastered up against the outside of the container. Well, if they do that in a hot metal container, those roots are going to get burned. And all plants are going to have roots that want to reach outward, whether they're pot bound or not. It's the nature of plant roots. They want to reach outward. So to keep those roots from getting damaged, I definitely recommend lining a metal container. So these folks have got some chives, they've got tomatoes, they've got peppers going on. They've got a nice little garden on their back deck. The size of this container says that it ain't going nowhere. So you want to put something this big in place before you start filling it with soil. Soil is extremely heavy, especially when it's moistened. So just bear that in mind before you go filling your containers. Again, this picture here with the tomatoes is a little unrealistic. This is a rather stubby looking plant for the huge volume of tomatoes. So something tells me there was some chemical intervention that took place with that, but it's awful pretty and the container is lovely. So whatever suits your aesthetic as far as your container, the size, the shape, the color of your container, you definitely should have something that's going to work for you. So here's some more metal garbage cans and a metal washing tub. These folks have got some trailing nasturtiums growing here. I'm not going to talk a lot about edible flowers in the presentation, but nasturtiums are definitely one of the nicer edible flowers out there. Thing to bear in mind with any flowers that you have done your research on and have confirmed that, yes, that is edible, make sure you know where you're getting it from. Because, you know, maybe those roses by their nature are edible, but maybe you bought them at a farm stand or at Stu Leonard's or whatever, and you don't know what they were treated with before they got to you. So if you're growing your own edible flowers, then you're all set. You know exactly what's gone into that. But if you're buying them, you don't know if they were sprayed with heaven knows what, that at least might change the flavor, at worst could be toxic. So that's not something that I would mess with. This is a plastic garden trug. With any of your containers, make sure that you have good drainage. So this plastic container, when it comes from the manufacturer, does not have holes in the bottom of it. So you want to make sure that you get the drill out and you drill some holes in the bottom before you go filling that puppy with soil. People think that underwatering plants is the best way to kill them. In fact, most container plants or house plants get killed from overwatering rather than underwatering. So we do want to find that balance, but if we don't have good drainage, then we're very likely to drown those plants. So this container here is a plain old 5-gallon pail a la Home Depot that they decided to wrap in burlap. I think that's brilliant. They had a wooden box here that they're growing their lettuce in. A lot of good options. Now, this young man here has got a website called urbanorganicgardener.com, and this is his fire escape. Now, I don't want to know what the city would have to say about the safety codes here, because I don't know how passable that is if there were a fire, but he is growing all of his own food on his fire escape. So I give him a lot of credit for that. And he just has grabbed old food service containers and soda bottles and so forth, dressed them up a little bit, and using every last inch of space so that he can grow his little garden. We can make a garden wherever we have a little bit of light. Now, this setup is interesting to me. So they've drilled their holes in their kiddie pools and they have planted, looks to me like they've got some squash here and certainly some tomatoes. My question with this is, tomatoes have got really long tap roots. Now, obviously, with this kind of setup, those tap roots are not going down, they're going out. So it looks like they've got it set up pretty well. They've got irrigation going on here, wrapping around. So, I mean, good for them. They're utilizing their concrete patio well in my book, and they've managed to stake things. There's the squash a little further in the season, looking much bigger. So make sure that you've got enough soil to accomplish what you need to accomplish in your raised beds or your unusual containers, and experiment. See what you can come up with. There's some great ideas out there and it doesn't hurt to try. So let's talk about a few specific things. Let's talk about fruit first. Now, this is one of my favorites. When we took the Master Gardener class way back in the day, we had a fellow who owned a local orchard come in to talk to us about the segment on tree fruits. And he said, if you ever have a client come into the Master Gardener office for advice on growing tree fruits, the best thing that you can tell them is don't. And all of us groaned because all of us wanted to grow apples and peaches and all these great things. If you want to grow tree fruits for your own purpose and you don't mind if they're a little ugly and they're a little bit bug eaten or whatever, then no concern. If you want to grow tree fruits that are pretty, then you have to do a bunch of research, contact the Master Gardener office. We've got all the information, and you need to set up a spraying regimen because there are certain insects and diseases that attack the trees when they're just starting to show a little bit of pink in the bud. And there's other ones that attack them when the last blossom has dropped off. And there's other ones that attack when the fruits are just about an inch long. There's this whole structured regimen if you want to stay ahead of all the various pathogens that can be attacking your trees. Plus, you have to know how to prune them properly and so on and so forth. My humble opinion, though, I would grow apple trees just for the blossoms because I think they're absolutely beautiful. So if we get the apples, that's a wonderful thing. You can grow them just for the beautiful. Now, some of you might be familiar with a technique called espalier. And a friend of mine says, yes, that's French for plant torture. You can kind of see in the lower right picture here what I'm referring to. Espalier, I don't know what the actual translation is, but what it boils down to is you are training a tree or another woody plant to grow flat up against a wall or a fence or other flat surface, the side of a building. And it's about heavy pruning. It's about tying the branches off properly so that it's supported well. This is a much more mature espalier, and you can see the horizontal branches on this. So if you're into fussing over woody plants, it's a really neat idea. It's a really neat technique. And it is something that requires ongoing maintenance. So, if you have that kind of time and you want to play with it, someday I'm going to have the inclination toward espalier. And for now, I'm going to just keep admiring it in other people's gardens. But you can get a surprising amount of fruit from it. So peaches. Peaches make my little heart go pitter patter. That's my very favorite. When I was growing up, we had a magnificent peach tree in the backyard, and the sapling had actually come from grandma's compost pile. And it finally got so heavy with fruit one year before my dad could prop it up that it split. It just fell to the ground. We all just cried. Peaches can be a challenge. There are a lot of critters and diseases that go after the peaches, but the peach crop, if you can get some of it, there's nothing like a local homegrown peach. It's just, that flavor is magnificent. A few years ago in the Northeast, we had a very badly timed late frost, and all of the peach blossoms got killed with frost. We had no peach harvest that year whatsoever. So there's a lot of different ways that your heart can break as a gardener. As I've said on more than one occasion, we never really learn to curse until we could become gardeners. And sometimes it's the weather gods that are thwarting us. But peaches are another plant that I will grow them just for the blossoms, because even though they're pretty ephemeral, they're only going to be there for a week or so, they are just breathtaking. So grow them for the pretty. Strawberries. Strawberries are going to be one of the easiest fruits you can grow in your garden. Now, I strongly recommend not going for the great big pretty strawberries. Go for the smaller ones. They're much more flavorful. There are pots that are specifically designed. These are called strawberry pots, and you can get a lot of plants and a lot of return for a very little bit of real estate. One of the great things about strawberries is, by their nature, they're viney. So they send out all these little tendrils, and at each point on the tendril where there's a set of leaves, there's also the potential for a set of roots. So you get tons of free plants when you grow strawberries. So this year you have 3, next year you can have 30. So just know that you've got the option for a lot of extra plants there, and you can get a lot of really nice return from them. Now, I'm not sure how I feel about this setup. For starters, I don't think it's pretty. But really, my big question with this is, if this is as air and water permeable as it appears to be, that little tiny pocket of soil is going to dry out in a heartbeat. So unless each one of these pockets is lined in plastic and has a couple of drainage holes, I don't know that this is necessarily an optimal way to grow really anything, but it's an idea. We can grow things on walls. We can hang things on walls and grow them. Know that if you're hanging these things on a wooden wall, that you're holding moisture to that wall and you could contribute to rot, but it's a thing to think about. So blueberries are another terrific thing for us to grow that are relatively easy. The biggest thing with blueberries is we want to make sure that we are throwing some sort of netting over them to keep the birds away from the harvest, because they will just decimate your blueberry harvest. Blueberries want really acidic soil. They're in the ericaceous family, which they're distantly related to rhododendrons and azaleas and laurels. All of these guys want acidic soil. One of the best ways to acidify your soil in a really gentle way is to put your used coffee grounds out there under the blueberry bushes. Every time you empty the coffee pot, have a bowl set aside for those coffee grounds and just put them out there under the blueberry bush. And it gives a very slow feed of a little bit of extra acid, and it'll keep your blueberries very happy. These guys have very pretty little blossoms. They're kind of tiny. They won't really turn your head, but people forget that you get a wonderful bonus with blueberries in glorious fall color. So rather than growing burning bush, which is a horribly invasive species, grow some blueberries in those spots where you want that beautiful fall color. You can get the high bush blueberry that will get, I want to say, up to about 10 feet tall, but of course you can prune them if you like. The low bush blueberry it can be very low growing, and blueberry can be tolerant of a little bit less sunshine. So you're not going to get as much fruit production. You're only going to get optimal fruit production if you are in full sun, but it's definitely worth a shot. So raspberries. Raspberries are a type of cane fruit, C-A-N-E. We do have some that grow wild around here. There's an invasive species called wineberry, which the canes have got so many prickles on them, they almost look fuzzy. I think you probably know the one that I'm referring to. And the berries are almost translucent. They're a very pretty red. I strongly encourage you to eat all those wine berries because we don't want them going into the soil and making more plants. They're terrible invasive species. But the traditional raspberry, this is a fabulous plant to grow in the garden. Now, you can also get golden raspberries. This picture, unfortunately, they got a little frost, but these are delicious. And these guys, this is the angels sing when I look at this picture. These are not blackberries. These are black raspberries, or as we called them when I was growing up, black caps. Now, the difference, these are blackberries. So the difference, you got a little bit of a white blush on the black caps that isn't on the blackberries. And think about the blackberries that you get in the grocery store. They're pretty much solid, whereas a raspberry is kind of a cap. It's a hollowed out thing. The black caps, the black raspberries, are a cap, just like a raspberry. They've got that hollowed out center. And black raspberries, if you have never had them, they are beautifully flavorful. They're amazingly sweet, and they make blackberries pale in comparison. So I strongly encourage you to grow black caps. They do grow wild in this part of Connecticut. They are a native species. And as my dad used to say, a black cap is green when it's red. So if you have one that is still red or still has some red to it, don't bother picking it. It's not ripe yet. Wait until it's nice and black and absolutely falls off the cane right into your hand. They're wonderful. Now, the downside of most cane fruit is they've got prickers. They have finally started hybridizing some raspberries so that they don't, which that's lovely. But anytime you start hybridizing for one feature, you're going to lose from other features. So some people say that the ones that don't have the prickers aren't as sweet. I can't attest to that, but it's something to think about. If you decide that you're going to grow cane fruit and you really want to optimize whatever you choose to grow, I strongly suggest doing this sort of raised bed. So in this next picture, you get a better idea of the structure. So you've got these end pieces that are very sturdy. They're 4x4s. They're driven into the ground. You've got a raised bed because these guys do want to meander. So it'll be easier to, as in the previous picture, it'll be easier to mow the lawn. Where are you? There you are. It'll be easier to mow the lawn if you're in a raised bed. But the thing with cane fruit is you have to prune them properly. So every year you want to cut out the canes that are 2 years or older because they're going to bloom and fruit best on the newer canes. Also notice that you've got these cross pieces, and these ones that are partway up are not quite as wide as the top pieces. And these guys have got some clothesline going down. In the previous picture, they had some tight wire going down. The canes like to flop outward. So if we can support them with these wires going down or these clotheslines going down, they'll flop outward, but they won't flop onto the ground. And with doing that, it makes the fruit much more accessible because as with any good cane fruit, the best fruit is underneath. So you've got the raised bed so you don't have to hunker way down onto the ground. And you've got them leaning outward into your space so you'll be able to harvest more readily. So raspberries, anything in the raspberry cane fruit family, great things to grow in the garden if you want fruit. So let's talk about herbs. This, of course, is mint. It's probably peppermint. Peppermint, interestingly, I always thought that peppermint was the original and that other mints were hybridized from it. Come to find out, spearmint is actually the original mint, and peppermint and others were hybridized from that. But anything in the mint family is going to be something of a runner. It's going to propagate by seed and by roots that will run along the ground. And the stems of these plants will be square. If you cut them in cross section, they're square. So that helps to identify anything in the mint family. Mint, some people say, oh, it's so invasive. It's not technically invasive. It's rambunctious and it can be a bully and it can be a pain in the butt, but it pulls out quite readily. So if it's someplace you don't want it, you can ditch it without any big drama. So when you think of a large scale herb garden, you can be thinking of the formal knot gardens. None of these are my garden. I have neither the time nor the patience for this monkey business. If you do, then this is a really great way. It's a very meditative thing to do these kinds of little snippy snip gardens. One of the things you want to do is make sure that you have spare plants in another place, so that if you have one plant in this intricate knotwork that croaks, you have something that you can transplant in right away. Now, if you want to do something like that, but not quite that scale, you can just go geometric with a little raised bed like this. This in the center here is actually a bay laurel. We think of bay leaves and we just think of leaves in a jar in the spice section, but there is a type of laurel that is a bay laurel. And someone decided to make a topiary out of this, and they're in a much more temperate climate than we are. And I actually have a friend who has a bay laurel that she has had as a house plant for decades. I think she's had it since the early 70s. And it just moves with her wherever she moves. There's so many different options for the herbs and things that we can play with. Now, this is a little bit more my scale. Again, still not my garden, but I love the idea of using the radio flyer and honing one's skills with the clipping and the fussing. Now, these folks planted some herbs in a box. These folks decided to go what I call single note, so individual varieties in each pot. That's definitely more my speed. That's how I like to roll, because different plants have different watering needs and different fertilizing needs. Herbs are a little bit more forgiving on that, but I still like to have different things in different pots just to keep it a little bit easier. Now, these folks have mixed things in. We've got this is an orange mint down here. They've got some lettuce. There's probably lemon sage. We've got edible violas. We've got probably bronze fennel, tricolor sage, probably lemon thyme over here. This is lovely. This is a very pretty presentation. And in my experience, the plants are going to get really leggy really fast. So probably best to eat the lettuce out of that sooner than later and just move on and let things do as they will. The mint's going to take over in a heartbeat, but it's a very pretty presentation. Oops, there we go. Now, I look at this picture and I can smell it. We've got some nice flat leaf parsley. We've got some dill. We've got some chives. This picture is why I grow herbs. This is my idea of why we have them in the garden. A lot of folks will use them for medicinal purposes or for beauty products, and that's cool. And everybody should do what works for them. For me, it's about enhancing my dinner. So this, of course, is basil. Basil is one of the first herbs that people will want to grow in their gardens because it's got such wonderful return on investment. Basil is a plant. It is, believe it or not, related to mint. It's got that square stem to it. Basil, you can see the growing tip in the plant right here. And if you want to go full plant dork, that is the apical meristematic tissue. That is the point at which the plant is sending up its new growth. So these little leaves here are younger than these big leaves in the background. There's a little growing tip on this branch over here. And in a few days, these leaves are going to be bigger. When a basil plant decides that it's time to make little basil plants, it's going to do what we call bolt. Now, that is when a plant that we are growing for its leaves decides to put up a flowering stalk. Now, we talked earlier about the cabbage, when the head splits and it sends up a flowering stalk. That is bolting. And when the basil bolts, it sends up that flower stalk from the center. We've all seen it if we have ever seen a basil plant growing. There's a spike that comes out the center, and there's little white flowers all along the sides of it. Generally speaking, if we are growing a plant for the leaves, which we are with 99.9% of herbs, generally speaking, when that plant bolts, the leaves are not going to taste like we want them to. Either they'll go bitter, or they'll be flavorless, or maybe they'll just croak, whatever it may be. But we don't want these plants to flower. So thing one, when your basil starts to send up what looks like a little flower bud, you'll know because it doesn't look like the leaf buds, like the little cluster of leaf tissue here. When it starts to do that, you simply snip that out from the center. You take your thumbnail and your forefinger and you pinch it back. That, by the way, is the origin of the term green thumb, because if you pinch back enough plants, your thumb starts to turn green. It's not going to be thwarted for long. The time is going to come when it's going to say, hey, yo, I am going to bloom overnight and you can't stop me. Because the purpose of any plant is to make more plants. That's what they're here for. But the great thing about basil is when you're ready to start harvesting it, it's starting to think about bolting a little bit. You don't have to just pinch back that tip. You can cut that plant down to just 1 or 2 sets of leaves. So you've got a plant that's this tall, but it's got a set of leaves down here. You can snip it off so it's only this tall. As long as you keep that 1 set of leaves, it's got the opportunity to send out more growth. Now at the Giving Garden, we will harvest our basil that is, whatever, 10, 12 inches tall. We'll harvest it down to 3 or 4 inches high at least once a week. And then next week, it's right back up there again. And after a fashion, it starts to get a little bit woody. The stems start to get a little too sturdy, but we've gotten a lot of harvests out of those plants. So don't give up and say, oh my gosh, it's bolted, it's done, I'm done, forget about it. You can still get a lot of harvest out of it. So basil, of course, we want to make pesto out of it with our mozzarella. If you've got too much basil, like that could ever happen. If you've got too much, make your pesto. Put it in the freezer. Put it in ice cube trays. Some of us remember ice cube trays. Freeze them in the ice cube trays. Pop them out of the tray. Put them in a plastic bag. Put them in the freezer. You can use it for pesto, or you can use it to put in your spaghetti sauce or whatever all through the winter, and you've got this glorious summer flavor. So I strongly recommend doing that. Now, parsley. The debate rages on with Lebanese and Italian grandmothers over curly leaf or flat leaf parsley. But I tell you right now that the swallowtail caterpillars don't care. They love both of them. Swallowtail caterpillars require a plant that is in the same family as parsley, an umbelliferous plant, which is to say a plant that has flowers that grow in umbels. Think umbrella, think Queen Anne's lace. Queen Anne's lace is the actual plant that our garden carrots were hybridized from. All of these plants, the foliage is required by the little caterpillars for the swallowtail butterfly in order for them to make their chrysalis and make butterflies. So if you find these guys in your garden, please don't kill them. They're there for the butterflies. Learn to live with a little bit of damage to your foliage. It means that you're part of the larger ecosystem, because this is what we're looking for, is the swallowtail. Now, sage. Sage is a perennial herb. Not most of our herbs are going to wind up being annuals or biennials. Annual means that it does its entire growth cycle in 1 year. Biennial means that this year we get a cluster of leaves and next year it's going to bloom. Perennial, think perpetual. Perennials have got a multi-season life with them. There are short-term and long-term perennials, but sage does pretty well year after year. Because it's a perennial, the flavor of sage is not going to be damaged if it blossoms. During its blossom, it's not the optimal time to harvest it. And the blossoms are lovely. So I just go out and pick the flowers for the bouquets. But the sage leaves are just, there's certain things you just can't have without sage. The hybridizers have of course gotten hold of sage. So we have purple sage and we have tricolor sage and we have lemon sage. All of them taste just as magnificent. So some of them just have more ornamental value to them. Rosemary, you can get upright rosemary or prostrate rosemary. Know which one you're getting. They're equally flavorful, but of course the visual is going to be different. The prostrate rosemary is more running. The upright rosemary, they literally have hedges of this stuff in the Mediterranean where it's from, or in places like Seattle where the environment is similar enough to the Mediterranean. So there's the upright rosemary. If you've ever gotten one of those rosemary Christmas tree topiaries and it croaked on you, don't blame yourself. The old herbalists had a saying, a dry rosemary is a dead rosemary. When we winter over our rosemaries indoors, because around here they can't really winter over outdoors. It's another perennial plant, but they're very tender around here. When we bring them indoors to overwinter, people forget that they need to water them. They can't be waterlogged. They won't survive if they're waterlogged, but they have to be kept from drying out. What will happen with these rosemary topiaries is they'll be glorious when we get them, and we'll be religious about watering them and keeping them moist. And still, one day we'll come down from the bedroom and there'll be just all these rosemary needles all over the dining table because the blessed thing just died overnight. They die really dramatically, really quickly. It wasn't you. Unless these things were purchased directly from a grower, there's every chance that at some point in transit between the grower and you, they were allowed to dry out. For as much as rosemary dies really dramatically, it doesn't die immediately after being damaged. So don't kick yourself if you've ever had one croak on you. If you can winter these guys over in a nice cool spot and keep them properly watered, sometimes you'll be blessed with some really pretty flowers at the end of the winter. Again, it's a perennial, so the flowers aren't going to damage the flavor at all. So thyme, there's a gazillion different kinds of thyme. Some of it's a little bit taller. Tall for thyme is like 8 inches. So some of them are really low growing. There's the really fuzzy, creepy guys. The blossoms are always beautiful. It's another perennial, so it's perfectly lovely to let them blossom. Definitely grow thyme in between the stones in your walkway, especially if it's a walkway that doesn't get traffic in the winter. If it's a walkway that gets traffic in the winter and thus needs to be shoveled or plowed, the thyme isn't going to survive it. But if it's that walkway around the corner of the house that you just kind of forget about through the winter and you let the snow pile on it, that will insulate the thyme enough and it will probably survive. But if it's exposed to the elements in the winter, it's not going to survive it. But it's really pretty between those walkway stones, the variegated forms, a lot of different options with the thyme. Now, chives. Chives are one of the most bulletproof things that you can grow. I strongly recommend growing chives. Of course, everybody says, yeah, well, partway through the summer, they do the flop and it's terrible. Here's what you do. You get the big kitchen shears. You go out there, you cut these suckers to about 2 inches. And for about a week, they're going to look like a bad haircut. And then after that, they're going to come back and be perfectly happy and they're going to have better posture again. So don't get discouraged with chives. Again, they're a perennial. These guys are going to be blossoming in probably another month or so. And the blossoms are beautiful. You can make chive blossom vinegar. If you get really nice quality, either white wine vinegar or champagne vinegar, pack a container with the chive blossoms, pour the vinegar over it, put it in a dark cabinet for a couple, 3, 4, 5 weeks, however long you feel like. When you pull it out, you'll have these really nasty looking anemic chive blossoms. Sieve out the vinegar, you have this beautiful chive infused pink vinegar. And it's lovely for salads or to give as a gift. I will implore you, if you decide that you want to do that kind of using of your herbs, do not make herb oils. When we use our plant matter in oils, we absolutely must use up that oil within a week, 10 days at the most. And here's why. When you put plant matter in oil, you have created an anaerobic environment. This is the perfect environment for botulism to grow. I don't want you taking that chance. It's not a chance that I'm going to take. If you have a commercial kitchen and you know what you're doing, cool, rock on with that. But it's not a risk that I'm willing to take. Have your chives in the summer, make your chive blossom vinegar in another few weeks, and it'll be a wonderful thing to enjoy. Have your chives on your baked potatoes. Dill, dill is easy to grow in the garden. It's bulletproof. It's another great source for your swallowtail butterfly larvae. The dill seeds you can use for your cooking. And then cilantro. Cilantro is wonderful. It grows really easily and it bolts in a heartbeat. So you need to be lopping that stuff off pretty much as soon as it's a few inches tall. As Susan from the Brookfield Food Pantry can tell you, this stuff, it gets really big really fast. You can see that the foliage here is going from the sort of parsley shaped foliage to this ferny foliage. This has begun to bolt, and in about 20 seconds, it's going to look like this. Now, the seeds from cilantro are coriander. So if you want coriander, then harvest the seeds by all means. But just know that cilantro bolts really quickly. So does anyone have questions at this point? Did anything come up in the chat, Aurelio, that you wanted to share? Because I know that we're right at the end of our time here.
Yes, Donna, we have a question from Sharon. Should a raspberry bush be netted like a blueberry bush?
Should it be netted, did you say?
Yes.
You can. The birds are less likely to get at raspberries because the fruit is underneath the foliage. And honestly, unless you have supports outside the raspberry bush, you might just find yourself fighting with the netting and the prickers and so forth. So I don't net the raspberry bushes, but if you choose, you can. It's, as I say, not necessary.
Also, are there any tips for growing dill?
Growing dill. Dill is painfully easy to grow. Plant it someplace where you're going to like the look of it. We planted it at the Giving Garden many years ago. We will never again not have dill because we let it go to seed once and now we have seeds all over the garden. I like to grow dill in the back of my flower beds. Although you could even grow it in the front of the flower beds because it's sort of transparent with the really open foliage like that. And the flowers make lovely cut flowers. But it's fine with rich soil. Most herbs are fine with lean soil. The dill is pretty forgiving. I don't know if that was helpful.
Yeah, it was just, I guess there was issues with sun and heat. So hold on a second. We have
Yeah,
some more
definitely it's best in sun.
Okay. There are many varieties of tomato plants. Any
Oh,
suggestions for planting in?
there are many varieties of tomato plants.
Yeah, for any suggestions for planting?
So I strongly recommend that you choose a variety that's going to be what you're looking for. So if you are going to be making sauce, you want to get the Italian plum tomatoes. If you want them for sandwiches, you know, the beefsteak or the early girl or the big boy or those ones. There's a lot of heirloom tomato varieties out there. There's black ones and there's striped ones and there's all sorts of crazy things. We have found at the Giving Garden that we do better with the, if you will, normal tomatoes, just the round red ones, because our recipients kind of don't know that, oh, that green tomato actually is ripe because it's this heirloom variety. But if tomatoes are something that you're really into, I would recommend experimenting with a few different varieties and seeing if there's one that you like better than another. tomatoes are another one that if you're growing kind of an open garden as opposed to a container garden, if you have one that the birds got to and you chuck it off into the side yard or whatever, well, now you have tomato seeds in the side yard, and you're probably going to get a tomato plant growing over there next year. And it might be a great one because it might have cross-pollinated with something else in the garden. You might make a whole new variety there. So definitely experiment. The grape tomatoes and the cherry tomatoes, there's a lot of varieties with them. Make sure you keep harvesting those ones because they are huge producers.
Last question. Of course, thank you so much, Donna, for this wonderful presentation. And please reach out to her. I think what I'll do is I'll send a follow-up email along with a survey and including Donna's email. So you can email her any questions in case you may have forgotten any during the presentation. And this presentation will be recorded and archived on the Danbury Library's YouTube page. And one last thing, one last question. How do you get involved with the Giving Garden in Brookfield?
So reach out to me. We will be doing our planting day on June 6th this year. We are looking for, you have to either be an experienced gardener or an inexperienced gardener. Those are the requirements. We are looking for people who want to just come out and get dirty, want to play in the dirt. Reach out directly to me, because not only do we have our planting day on June 6th, but right after that, 5 times a week, we have shifts at the garden where we are doing work, watering and weeding and pruning and eventually harvesting. We need help distributing the harvest. We've got all sorts of things going on, and we do have mentors at the garden for all of those 5 shifts during the week. We've got 3 weekday evenings and then Saturday and Sunday mornings. So reach out to me. I'll be glad to put you in touch with the right people.
Awesome. How about one more question? What is the best flower to plant next to an eggplant?
Oh, that one I don't know off the top of my head. There's definitely one of the best things to plant as far as drawing in pollinators is anything that has got a flower that's shaped like a daisy. So you've got that center, and then you've got the ray flowers around the edge. Those are the ones, those shaped flowers generally are the ones that attract the most pollinators.
Thank you so much, Donna. And thank you for everyone for joining us this evening.